thing I've left out, I just simply overlooked it. Concordant of Worms. That's something that I left out. I mean, it was a compromise the church and the state reached, to where the church could appoint its own officials. And that is something that made Europe unique. It guaranteed Europe's separation of church and states, and then when the Protestant Reformation came later, church and state still remained separate. So this did not apply to Russia now. In Russia, church and state remained one. In the Muslim world, church and state remained one. Among the Orthodox, church and state remained one. But among the Roman Catholics, church and state remained separate. And a lot of folk believe that this is one of the things that helped boost Western Europe. The church remained the church, the state remained the state, and eventually the two of them got to where they could function side by side as independent entities, with neither one of them controlling the other. All right. Okay. Anybody have any questions? I mean, was the traffic bad? I don't know. I got here at 6:30 and nobody. And the day was not gloomy and rainy either. So, you know, it reminds me of a letter our president wrote to us about 2 semesters back, that this is a time in the semester when grandmothers die by the scores, when cars break down and somehow can't be fixed, when computers break down and they're unfixable, and everything seems to go wrong at once. He said, I'd hate to be any student's uncle at this time of the semester because uncles are dying in rows. Just one thing after another. But anyway, keeping people away. Now, if your grandmother really has died, you have my sympathy. But you know, I had 2 grandmothers once. One of them I never saw. Died when my father was 6 years old. Anyway, that's another issue. All right, we'll move on then. I left off last time with indulgencies. In Europe, during the High Middle Ages, universities got started. The first university in Europe was in Bologna, Italy. Essentially, somebody got the brilliant idea of getting a bunch of learned men together in one place, and they would teach younger men what they knew. And again, folks, I mean, I keep harping on this, but it was Western Europe that was to become the intellectual center of the world, and also the technological center. It was in Western Europe that burst out at seams and overspread the globe. And many, many books have been written as to why this happened. One reason might have been the universities. Europe got its intellectually elite people together in a few places, and they began to train younger students. The first one was in Bologna, Italy, and the next one, well, the first one north of the Alps was in Paris. Italy had several universities before finally a king of France got the idea of starting a university in Paris. The university at first was something that just met like out in the open under the trees on a nice day, and a professor would get a bunch of students around him and he would expound what he knew. A lot of the learning was by memorization or by rote, but they would teach subjects like Latin, logic, but especially theology. Theology, reasoning, but a lot of what they taught was a look back to the ancients, and a lot of what they taught was Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher. They began to become really enamored with him in spite of the fact that he lived in a pre-Christian era and could hardly be called a Christian. But it was said that they baptized him, in effect made him into a Christian. Universities became, after a while, degree-granting institutions to show that you had a lot of knowledge and had learned a lot. The 3 degrees they had were the bachelor's, the master's, and the doctorate. These 3 degrees still exist, but there have been some added to them. The specialist degree right here, the associate degree, the 2-year degrees. In today's world, the bachelor's means you have a 4-year college degree, the master's 1 year beyond that, and then the doctorate's usually about 4 years beyond the bachelor's, 3 years beyond the master's. These degrees still exist, and they would serve as qualifications for appointments or for jobs. Along came the scholastics, the school of scholasticism. And it dealt with a conflict between faith on the one hand and reason on the other. Faith and reason, because inevitably, you start advancing your knowledge of science, and it's going to start appearing that some of the things that science seems to teach is going to conflict with your faith, or your philosophy, or your worldview. And this is true of every religion, every faith. In the case of Islam, I mean, when their faith got to conflict with reason, Islam just simply stopped advancing. And in the case of Christianity, there came conflicts with faith and reason. And a lot of churchmen stood up against the scientific advancement, but Christianity and science overcame it, and science marched on. Now, folk, I could spend an entire semester talking about this topic right here, the conflict between faith and reason. But I want to tell you something I just bumped into within the last week or so. There's too many. I mean, most of the inventions today are invented by corporations. Rockwell has invented this. IBM has invented that. And they've been invented by teams of engineers working together. But there's a certain device called an EM drive. And related to it is the Koenig drive. These two sort of have a promise of being space drives that will carry rockets into space and could theoretically get us to Mars in as quickly as 90 days. Today's rockets take 8 months, but not just 3 months to get to Mars. And here's the catch. Nobody knows how they work. I mean, Newton's third law of motion, for every action, there must be an equal but opposite reaction. You get burning rocket fuel going one way, the rocket will go the other way. This has reaction, but no action. Basically, it's contrary to all the laws we know of physics. Now, I want to ask this class something. In the realm of theoretical science, how much can we say that we really know? And I can give you a hint, it can be summed up in one 7-letter word. What do we know for sure in the realm of theoretical science? One word. Answer. Anybody know? Anybody want to venture a guess? One word sums up everything that we, I mean, in the realm of practical science, we put a gadget together and make gadgets. Oh, we're making better gadgets. I mean, but I'm talking theoretical science, theory. In theory, what theory do we have that will explain the universe? What theories do we have? I mean, come on. Every class I've taught, somebody's answered this. In one word, what we know about the universe on a theoretical level is nothing. Every theory we have has some compelling reason why it can't be true. All right, well, I'll start with Newton's law of gravity. Newton's law of gravity works well inside our solar system. Start checking it out in interstellar space among the stars, and we find out that 90% of the matter, at least, that should be there to hold the universe, the galaxies together, is missing. So we invent something called dark matter. Any of you heard about what I'm talking about? Dark matter. To try to explain, they said there must be dark matter, the matter that we can't see, but nevertheless matter that has a gravity pull. and it makes up 90% of the universe. We can't see it. Then we have galaxies going away from us at 25,000 miles a second. But where's all this energy coming from? Well, there must be somewhere where we can't see, but there must be a bunch of dark energy pulling these galaxies away from us. The fact is, our theories, every theory we have has some compelling reason why it cannot be true. And this holds for all fields of knowledge. On a field of practical science, we can make better automobiles, we can make better tires for our cars, we can make better radios, better cell phones. That's gadgetry, putting gadgets, putting parts together. In a field of how things work, why things work, we actually don't know. So, in other words, faith and reason, they had a conflict then. The conflict between faith and reason is still going on. I say let it. A lot of people did not approve of the study of Aristotle. All right, the most outstanding scholastic was St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, you might not think of him as being the equal to Plato and Einstein and Newton. But there have been men down through the ages who have explained the whole universe. I'm not saying they really did, but they thought they explained it. They explained it in such a way that the people of their time and people of later times believed. This man is one of them. Today he's fallen far out of, as science progressed, he was left behind. But Thomas Aquinas believed that he could explain everything. Now, Albert Einstein came along there. Albert Einstein worked on a unified field theory, or sometimes we call it the TOE. But I've recently read that there are scientists today who would tell us that there's some things about this universe of ours that are simply not going to be explained. That every explanation we have, again, has somewhere some compelling reason why it can't be true. With Thomas Aquinas believed that he could explain everything, and suppose he explained the universe. He tried to reconcile all knowledge into one unified body. Again, and if he could come back to visit me today, I'd say, hey, Mr. Aquinas, we're still working on it. We've made discoveries that you cannot imagine and cannot even conceive, but we still are just as much in the dark about some things as you were. In fact, if anything, we're even more in the dark than you were, because you didn't realize how much in the dark you actually were. Church services began to be conducted in the vernacular. The word vernacular means the local language. Instead of in Latin. Now, some of your services are still conducted in Latin, but more and more the church began to speak, and eventually they started writing the Bible in the local language. That took a long time. Again, one reason why that Christianity was able to drift as far as it did was not only were Bibles very expensive when it took 8 months for a person to copy, but they were written in Latin, and very few Europeans understood Latin. Then they began to translate the Bible into the language of the ordinary person, and it brought about a Reformation. Cathedrals. All right. There wound up being two main types of cathedrals, the Romanesque and the Gothic. The Romanesque were somewhat shaped like a wigwam. They were rounded. They had to figure out some way to get a stone roof on a stone building, so the answer was to make a rounded structure like the Indian wigwam. They were dark inside, had I'm going to call them barrel roofs. Dark. They were lit by candles mostly, but they were sturdy. In contrast, the Gothic, and the word Gothic has nothing to do with the Goths, but it's just like a misnomer. The Gothic cathedrals had the pointed arches that seemed to suggest heaven or skyward. Pointed arches, and they had stained glass windows. Pointed arches, stained glass. Therefore, they were usually pretty well lit inside. A lot of them, I'm going to try to draw, they had what's called ribbed vaults. What do I mean by ribbed vault? Essentially was where that they would, one after another, in the shape of rib. Now your book does show pictures of the two types of cathedrals, the Romanesque and the Gothic. The Gothic cathedrals were lit inside in the daytime, at least because of the stained glass. But if you went inside one on a bright sunny day, like this one is, there'd be all kinds of colors showing through the stained glass. And again, this was to create the effect that you're in another world, as well as the rib vaults pointing heavenward was to suggest heaven, or the other world. All right. Moving on now to chapter 13. Okay. The Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire basically lasted 1,000 years. It began when the Western Roman Empire fell. It was what was left of the Roman Empire. There was the Roman Empire in the east, but its capital was at the old city of Byzantium. That's where we got the name Byzantine. Byzantium, which Constantine renamed Constantinople. While the Western Europe was declining, the Byzantine Empire was thriving. Eventually, what happened? The Byzantine Empire refused to recognize the hegemony of the Pope. So the church split, with the Eastern Orthodox, sometimes called Greek, the Greek Orthodox split off from the Western Church and formed a separate church. They have remained split to this day. And there are some issues. One of the issues was just who was in charge. The Eastern Greeks said all the patriarchs are equal in authority. The patriarch at Rome said, no, I should be the head because Rome is the capital. So they split. They have a few other differences. Another difference being the Eastern Orthodox allow some of their clergy to marry. A clergyman has to decide beginning, are you going to be a married clergyman or not? If he decides to remain an unmarried clergyman, he's expected to never marry. If he decides he's going to be a married clergyman, then he has limits as to how high it can go, because the high up patriarchs are expected to be celibate. This word celibate means to live a life with no sex, no sexual activity. The Western, of course, Church has demanded to this day that all of its clergy, from the parish priest all the way up to the Pope, be celibate. The Eastern Byzantine Empire kept getting whittled away and whittled away. Now again, I could go into a lot more detail, folk. We could take an entire course on the Byzantine Empire, but that's not the design of this course. But its capital was Constantinople. And Constantinople was the biggest city in Europe for many generations. All right, about 45 years ago, Kellogg's Cornflakes used to advertise, and one of the jokes they put out was, what is the corniest city in the world? Well, the corniest city in the world was Constantinople. Well, yeah, but they changed its name to Istanbul. The Constantinople today is now called Istanbul. When the Byzantine Empire fell, the Muslims renamed it Istanbul. But formerly it was called Constantinople. Anyway, Constantinople, I mean, the Byzantine Empire kept getting whittled away at its size. When they fought long wars with Persia, which they eventually won. Then came the Muslims out of Arabia, and the Muslims began taking more and more territory. One thing that saved the Eastern Empire for a while was the invention of Greek fire. Greek fire, again, I think I mentioned it. We don't know what it was for sure. There was a secret passed down. It was said that when a ship got set on fire by Greek fire, the ship was doomed, nothing would devour, and even when the ship was going down, you could see the fire still burning as the ship went to the bottom, down to the bottom of the ocean. Of course, obviously, eventually the fire was out. And folk, we do not have a good explanation of what Greek fire was. Most people believe it was a mixture of perhaps tar and sulfur, and maybe a little bit of gunpowder included. We're not sure what it was, but it was a secret, and at one time it's even believed that a Muslim got hold of the secret, but it was passed from one secret person to another secret person. But the Byzantines had the weapon for a while, and they used it to keep the Muslims at bay for a long time. Eventually, the Crusades weakened the Byzantine. Ironically, it was a Byzantine emperor who asked Western Europe, say, please come and help me fight these Muslims. They're more than I can handle. So the Western world sent the Crusades in, and ironically, it was the Crusades that wound up sacking Constantinople and paving the way for the destruction of the Byzantine Empire. In 1453, now this used to be the dividing line between medieval and modern. Two things happened. Number one, Constantinople fell, and with it went the Byzantine Empire. Number two, the 100 Years' War ended, which I'll talk about later. But two things happened in 1453 that has led some historians to say that's the dividing line between medieval history and modern history. The first significant emperor, though, of the Byzantines was Justinian. Justinian came in on the scene just as the Western Empire was declining, but he wound up conquering most of the Mediterranean area, and he almost restored the Roman Empire. However, there was a financial collapse that occurred. I mean, in those days, they did not know as much about economics as we do, and there was someone to say we might not know as much about it as we think we do. But a financial collapse occurred even before he died, when he was getting kind of old and feeble. And within 3 years of his death, the empire he built had collapsed. And it was back to the old ways where the Byzantines lost their North African colonies and lost a lot of their Syrian, Eastern Mediterranean colonies also, North Africa. So they were greatly reduced in size within 3 years after he died. In addition to an economic collapse, a plague hit the empire, and maybe the plague had a lot to do with the collapse. Again, plagues are something we still have. I mean, just right now we're experiencing a threat of an E. coli breakout, but then it's only been about a year or two ago that there was a disease in Africa that was threatening the whole world. And we tried to contain it in Africa, but we got teams of doctors to go in there, and they somewhat brought the disease in check, and we think that we have it in check. But we still have problems with plagues. In those days, they did not know how to fight them. They did notice that plagues spread from one person to another. Therefore, they would try to avoid contact with sick people. But the plague would go on until it eventually burned itself out, but that would often take 50 years. Also, in addition to the Muslims, there came another group of people from Central Asia called the Bulgars. And again, I can't emphasize that Central Asians have come out, the Mongolians, the Huns, the Slavs, the Turks, the Magyars, group after group. The Bulgars came in and they threatened the empire for a while. Eventually, to make a long story short, the Eastern Orthodox Empire simply could not stand up to its invaders and collapsed. Now, one of the problems that Orthodoxy had, they did not separate church from state. Church was one with the state, when really the church should have been separated from the state. I mean, history has proven this to be the wise move time after time. Church and state, they were one. Another difference they had with Rome, instead of insisting their services be held in Latin, the church would be held in Latin, they would hold them in Greek. The New Testament had been written in Greek, and they believed that Greek was the language that should be spoken in religious services. Again, in the Western world, they started off speaking Latin, but then wound up speaking the vernacular. And this meant that more and more people could understand the Bible and the writings of the church fathers once they were written in the vernacular rather than written in Latin. In the case of the Greek, though, they held on to holding their services in Greek for a very, very long time. And your average person simply did not know what the Bible really said because they could not read it in Greek, in the Greek language. All right, again, the church split. The Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated the Pope, and the Pope excommunicated him. Now, folk, I had a friend at Lockheed for many years who was a Protestant minister who joined the Orthodox Church. And I told him, well, the problem I had with the Orthodox Church is every place where they have been in charge, if the Muslims have not taken over, the communists have. Russia was Greek Orthodox, and again, who took over? Eventually the communists did. But every place where they've been, the Muslims have wound up taking over. And he said that bothered him too. He wound up late in his life saying, he became an Orthodox priest, wound up saying, I wish I wouldn't have done it. He said, if I'd have known what I know now, I wouldn't have. But he was like, he invested so much in it, it was kind of too late. But he told me one time that when the patriarchs meet, all right, well, backing up a little bit. When Constantine set up the church, he appointed 5 patriarchs. One in Jerusalem, because that was where Christianity started. One in Antioch, because it was one of the bigger cities of the empire. And of course, one in Constantinople, where his capital was, and one in Rome. And one in Alexandria, because it was the 3rd largest city empire. So you had Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Rome, Constantinople, 5 patriarchs. Constantine never said that they were subject to the Patriarch at Rome. Well, the Patriarch at Rome insisted, the Bishop of Rome says, I should be the head. Anyway, when the Orthodox Church meets these days, they put down 5 chairs. 1 chair for the Patriarch of Alexandria, 1 chair for the Patriarch of Jerusalem, 1 chair for the Patriarch of Antioch, and 1 for the Patriarch of Constantinople. Now, the 5th chair is for the Pope. And I say, you can come and sit down with us if you just agree to be one of the boys. But if you want to be the head, stay home. So for more than 1,000 years, the Pope has stayed home. Because he simply has said, if I come, it's to be understood that I'm going to be the head. So the church is split and remains split to this day. All right, moving on. The Crusades began when the Emperor of the Byzantines sent a letter to the Pope asking the Pope to help him fight the Muslims. The result was the Crusades that lasted. Now here's the dates, 1095 to 1290. Almost to 195 years, basically almost 200 years. Now why did it end in 1290? Well, the Black Death hit Europe, and that forced everybody to stop the crusading zeal. But they last 200 years. Now there were some 200 crusades, but there were 4 that we'll talk about main ones. Actually, some historians say there were really 9 main ones, and then a whole bunch of other smaller movements. Essentially, the First Crusade was the only one that was a military success. The First Crusade was led by European nobles. No one really led it. It's just a bunch of European nobles and their knights got together. And they descended on the Muslim world and caught the Muslim world off guard and by surprise. The Muslim world at this time was weak and disunited. And they actually conquered the Holy Land. They conquered Jerusalem. And they drove the Muslims out of what is today Israel. And they set up a kingdom called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem was to last 100 years. Well, after the First Crusade, several years later, Europe got together a Second Crusade. The Second Crusade was led by kings, including Louis VII of France, who took his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine with him. It gained nothing. And eventually the Crusaders went home. But it was led by kings, and they thought, well, with kings leading, we'll get somewhere. It turned out that kings kind of got in the way. Again, the one king was King Louis VII of France. The Holy Roman Emperor got involved. Some kings of Italy also got involved. Then came the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade. Now, here's what happened to the Muslim world in the meantime. After the Second Crusade, there finally came what the Muslim world needed was a really, really charismatic, and I don't know how to describe him, a leader named Saladin. Saladin was able to unite all of his part of the Muslim world. No, he did not unite all of the Muslim world, but he got all of his part of the Muslim world together. Now, folk, about the time some of you were being born, Saladin was making news because Saddam Hussein was an admirer of 2 men, Nebuchadnezzar and Saladin. He admired Nebuchadnezzar because Nebuchadnezzar had conquered Babylon. I mean, probably he had conquered Israel, and carried the Jews captive, so he conquered the Jews. Saladin drove the Crusaders out of the Holy Land. The Third Crusade of the European was led by Richard the Lionhearted, 3 kings, Richard, Philip, Augustus. He was king of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick I. Well, Frederick tried to cross a river with heavy armor on and he drowned. So when Frederick drowned, his entire army turned around and went back home. So much for Frederick. I mean, they thought, hey, with these 3 kings, they can defeat the Muslims for once and for all. It was not to be. Philip Augustus, I'm not sure why, but he got to the Holy Land, fought a battle where he did not really win. He just simply turned around and went back home. That left Richard the Lionhearted, who was determined, and Richard tried hard, but simply Richard's efforts were not enough. Richard simply could not defeat Saladin. Even though Richard was a mighty warrior, strong warrior, he lost. Saladin's men were too much for him. And eventually Richard went home. So the Third Crusade was a flop. Then came the infamous Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade turned on Constantinople. It was supposed to be fighting the Muslims. Instead, it turned and sacked Constantinople. It took the Byzantines 40 years to get their city back. The Third Crusaders occupied Constantinople for 40 years, and eventually the Byzantine armies were able to drive the Crusaders out, but they had done irreparable damage to the Byzantine Empire, from which the Byzantine Empire was never able to recover. So the Byzantine Empire was actually hit by both the Crusaders and the Muslims, and they simply could not stand up to all that. All right, one thing I must mention about the Crusades. This story is going to sound unusual, but there was a crusade called the Children. Actually, there were two children's crusades. Folk, somehow or another, in Germany, someone went around and convinced a lot of children, I'm talking about ages 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16, to go on a crusade. They believed they could do what their adults could not. And folk, don't ask me how they ever persuaded their parents to let them go. Some people compared this story to the story of the Pied Piper, the piper who played music so sweet it would lure the children into a cave and the children never seen again. However, some 50,000 German children went on two crusades. None of them even reached Constantinople. Every one of the children who went were either killed or died on the way of disease or were sold into slavery. And I read a book about when I was a child how that some Muslims captured these children, and children would wind up trying to preach to the Muslim overlords, but to no avail. The Muslims, of course, refused to convert. But some 50,000. Now, there wound up being some nine main crusades and other movements that could be called crusades. A lot of persons have criticized the West. Hey, you shouldn't have done it. But here's my take. I think that eventually we're going to find out. I mean, the present situation, I'm jumping out of the year 2015, is going to teach us why Europeans decided they had to get up and simply carry the fight into their territory. I mean, during the Civil War, Robert E. Lee got tired of seeing his Virginia being torn apart by battle, so he tried to carry the fight into Maryland. Well, he lost. Then he tried to carry it into Pennsylvania and lost at Gettysburg. But the idea was, we're tired of having to fight in our own territory. Let's carry the fight into their territory and let them feel the destruction. There was something Germany was never able to do to us during both world wars, with the result of Germany lost. Germany actually tried to use Mexico as a base of operations, and during World War I, the Mexicans would not agree to it for whatever reason. But essentially, there's nothing more sinful than we're tired of waiting for you to come to us. We're going to take the fight to you. And I think, folks, we can better understand. Now, I'm going to jump around a little bit now. What happened was in 1290, the crusading stopped, where the crusades seemed to be a lack of success. But then, fast forward to the 15 and 16 and 1700s, all the technological advances, and I say all, I mean every technological advance the world made was made by the Europeans. The Europeans made better rifles, mixed up better gunpowder, had better artillery, had bigger and better warships, and they left the Muslims behind. And almost every Muslim nation was conquered by a European nation. Syria conquered by France, Palestine and Egypt conquered by Britain, Libya conquered by Italy, Algeria got most of Africa, including Mali, and on the old maps you'll see is a French West Africa and Algeria. Morocco escaped being conquered, and Saudi Arabia escaped being conquered. But for all, Israel, France got Iran also. All these Muslim countries wound up being conquered by Europe, because Europeans have forged ahead technologically. Then fast forward to the 21st century, and a lot of countries, European countries, feel like, hey, we're too civilized to fight. We're not going to fight these people. So then they start carrying the fight to us, and it's like the war is, I'm going to quote Abe Lincoln, the war is forced upon us. And what would be the result would remain to be seen. Look, I've been reading some articles who state the United States is in such a bad way militarily, the United States simply cannot win. Here's how we'll lose. If China and Russia and the Islamic world get together and team up, the United States does not have powerful enough allies to help us win against an alliance like that. We stand alone. And I'm not talking about an unreal scenario, folk. All right. Anyway, That's speculation. That's what might be. What actually was, the initial fight went to the Muslims. But then Europeans developed better technology, and for hundreds of years, Europeans conquered and held Muslim countries. Then after World War II, Europeans gave up their colonies. And the result is these people are now coming after us. All right. So much for the Crusades for now. Again, I had a teacher in graduate school who was really hard against them. I don't know what you think now, but he was all pro-Arab and talking about how great the Arabs were and how terrible his own European ancestors were. That might have been true in the 10 and 1100s. But then fast forward to the 15, 16, 1700s, the Muslim world fell behind. And one thing that really makes the Muslims upset, they can't understand why did all the technological advances go to the West and none go to us? Well, I think I know why. They did not allow their people freedom. Freedom to innovate. They do not believe in innovation. When science conflicts with theology, or appears to, they opt for theology instead of science, and the West opted for science even when it seemed to conflict with theology. I say seem to because I really don't think there is a conflict, but as science goes around and around in circles, there seems to be a conflict at times. I say seems to. All right, 1300s. It was a time of trouble, the 14th century. Here's what we know happened, folk. Now, folk, this is making news every day in a different context. What we know for sure happened, and this is in your book, the climate abruptly cooled. What caused the climate to cool, folk, we simply do not know. It might be, I mean, at one time, science was scoffed at the idea that the sun might be cooling down. But now we're saying, we once believed that the output of the sun was a constant, never changed, was guaranteed. But now we realize that the output of every star varies a little bit over time. And in fact, some stars vary really, really greatly from maybe even from one year to the next. The nearest star to us, Proxima Centauri, can vary by 50% of its output from time to time. So the output of our sun might have actually cooled down. We don't know why, but the climate cooled. Now these things seem to go, folk, in 400-year cycles. All right, in 1300, the climate cooled. In the late 1600s, almost 400 years later, the climate cooled again, and they had a little ice age. All right. Now, almost about 380 years later, we're in the year, oops. Do a little bit of math. The figures are approximate. Some people believe that we're in for another cooling spell. This is not the standard mainstream. If you want to be a scientist and get money from the government for your work, you'd better believe in global warming. Because if you don't, the government is not going to fund your project. I know it's 8 o'clock in the morning and a lot of it, but nevertheless, what we can prove, folk, this is fundamental history now. When the climate cooled, Europe experienced a famine. Between the years 1313 and 1317, there were major crop failures, extreme hunger. Crops were destroyed. Along with the summers becoming shorter and the summers becoming colder, there came frequent storms brought about by climate change. And hey, I don't doubt that climate change brings a lot of storms. And this was to lead to a period of famine. And then came, Genghis Khan came from Mongolia, and what Genghis Khan might not have been aware of was that some rats were following him. I mean, you know, he had thousands of men, and these men would camp at night, get up in the morning, but the rats would come in at night and try to steal his food and his supplies and leave their... the rats themselves did not carry a plague. What the rats carried were the fleas. They leave the fleas behind. The fleas would attract humans, would be attracted to humans. And these fleas carried a plague we know of as the Black Death. The Black Death hit Europe on a ship. I mean, let's face it, even in modern times, all rats, I mean, all ships have rats on them, and we just simply cannot figure out how do these rats get on board. But these ships somehow collect the rats, and the rats find ways to get into the hold of the ships and eat the food. The rats came on board some ships, and the Black Death then hit Europe in around the year 1307. And all told, the Black Death was destined to carry off 1/3 of Europe's population. I mean, it was a terrible time. And this time, folk, the church, unlike the plagues before where the church would be the one group that would stay by and help a sick person, the church was just as likely to abandon a sick person as was anyone else. The Black Death was a terrible, horrible, painful type of death where the person could not eat, among other things, died of starvation. I've had students do papers on it. Europe did not recover its population until the mid-1700s. Well, Europe started to recover its population in the early 1600s, but then came a little ice age in 1680, and millions more Europeans died. Then in 1750 or so, three things happened. Number one, the climate started to warm up. I mean, number two, someone discovered a smallpox vaccination. If you infected someone with dead cowpox viruses, it would immunize you against smallpox. Jenner was a man's name. And when the smallpox was vaccinated against, then someone else, Louis Pasteur, discovered that these microbes that we were seeing for about 100 years before that time, the first microbes were observed by microscope in around 1610, 1611. Well, Jenner figured out that these microbes cause disease, but microbes could be killed by soap and killed by heating, and hand washing would wash the microbes off. And this did a lot to raise the population of the whole world, including China and Europe, when we discovered that, hey, you know, we can control diseases somewhat just by killing germs. And it didn't hurt that the climate warmed. We were vaccinating against smallpox. And then Europe's population by 1750 got down back up to where it had been in the year 1300. The population of Europe reached its high around 1300, then got up to that point again in 1750. And the population of Europe was increasing big time until a few years after World War II, my generation, when Europeans decided to practice birth control and abortion, and most of them not even getting married, most of them not even having children, with the result that Europeans' population has declined as far as Europeans go. Other peoples who are not European are moving in. Same thing happened in the United States. So Black Death. Now, a couple of bad things came from the Black Death. One of them was that old maids were blamed for causing the Black Death because the old maids tended to not get the plague. Now, folk, I may have asked this before, but who knows what do old maids have around their dwelling places most of the time? Anyone know what old maids tend to keep around their apartments or dwelling places, their dwelling houses? You've all seen them, they're common items. Cats. Well, what did the cats have to do with it? Quite a bit. The cats kept down a number of rodents that were carrying the rodents were carrying the fleas that caused the plague. The old maids would keep the cats around, and we believe it was the cats that did a lot to preserve the old maids from getting the plague. I mean, the cats would, again, either chase the rodents or sometimes they catch them outright, eat them. But it's known that rodents will oftentimes just stay away from a place where there's a cat around, because if they don't, the ones that don't get eaten. But the old maids were blamed for being witches, so they went on witch hunts, and the witch hunts were to last until the late 1600s. The most famous American witch hunt was the Salem witch hunt of the late 1600s, 1680, 1681, They killed 21 people and made Salem into a ghost town. And after that, largely, people stopped hunting for witches. The other thing that came about was Jews also did not get the plague. And people said, oh, it's the Jews and their magic. Now, I don't know if Jews like cats so much, but what Jews did have was an emphasis on cleanliness. Moses had commanded the Jews be clean, but also it is known that every year in the wintertime, before the next harvest, the Jews would take all of their old wheat and all of their old stored food and take it out of their dwelling houses and clean their dwelling houses and all that and burn it. What good did this do them? Simply the lice that would be on the wheat, that would be on the lice that had been on the rats, but the lice was simply burned up when the wheat was burned up, the old wheat. The Jews again cleaned out their dwelling places every year, and this cleanliness is believed to have had a lot to do with why Jews did not get the plague. However, the Jews were accused of being witches themselves, with a result of a lot of pogrom. The word pogrom means specifically an attack against Jews. Now, folk, I must mention too, in connection with the Crusaders, a lot of the Crusaders would go to a Jewish community, set the Jewish community on fire, and then the Crusaders would lift up their hands and, they would lift up their hands and praise God hilariously, while the Jews inside were screaming their last and were being burned alive by the fires that was going on inside. The Christians thought they were doing God's service. This, folk, is standard history. The feeling of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, it's still with us. Still with us just as strong. It really reared its ugly head big time during World War II. But it's still there. It's sometimes called anti-Semitism. Again, a hatred of Jews. Well, during this time, there were a lot of rebellions. Peasants began to rise up in rebellion. And one thing that helped the peasants, folk, was as Europeans began to develop gunpowder, a lot of these guns found their way into the hands of the peasants. And the peasant realized that with a gun, he could even kill an armored knight. With a gun, he could even kill a lord. This was to lead to the lords having to respect their peasants more and to grant more privilege to the peasants, and eventually lead to most European nations developing some form of democracy. But peasant revolts were to run throughout Europe all the way from the 1300s. The last ones were in 1848, unless you count the Russian Revolution of 1917 as part of the same thing. But European peasants were to revolt against their overlords for hundreds of years. In the 1800s there was a revolt. Well, the French Revolution was in effect a peasant revolt. That was in 1790s. Then in 1830 there was a revolution. In 1832 a revolution in France. In 1848 a revolution in France. All told, and every time there was a revolution, the peasants seemingly lost to the peasant. But when the fight was over, the nobility and the kings would make concessions to them. So the peasants got more and more rights, more and more rights, more and more rights. Even though they lost the fight, they scared the nobility into making their life easier and giving them higher wages. And it basically a lot of the peasants got better. Well, with fewer workers, wages went up. This helped the peasants also because the nobles started stealing each other's workers. Prices went up. Some kings tried to limit rising wages and prices, but more and more serfs were able to buy their freedom. Towns sprang up. The nobles had a harder and harder time finding laborers. Eventually, this was to lead to recovery. Now, unlike the crisis of the 4th century, the 3 and 400s, in the 3 and 400s, Europe went into the Dark Ages. In the 1400s, Europe had a crisis, but Europe came out of it, basically on top of the world. Europe went into the crisis lagging behind India, lagging behind the Islamic world, to some extent lagging behind the American Indians, whom they did not know existed, and lagging way behind China. Europe came out of the crisis with more inventions, with more freedom for their people, and on their way to rising to the top of the world. All right, this brings us up to, and I have about 10 minutes, the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War it lasted 100 years, was fought between France on the one hand and England on the other. France on the one hand, England on the other hand. And it started. All right, to get it started, I want to delve into a story about the Knights of the Templar. During the Crusades, there were three orders of knights that came about: the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, and the Templars. The Hospitallers are known for setting up hospitals, becoming a charitable organization. The Teutonic Knights wound up moving into Poland and Latvia and Estonia. Their goal was to set up an ideal kingdom. But the Templars, set up banking businesses and pulled in a lot of Europe's money. Even kings started banking with them, and they got a great amount of wealth. Unfortunately, though, they would have nothing to do with charity, and the people started resenting them. Well, along came Philip the Fair of France. Philip, of course, was not eligible to join the Templars because he was married, and they only took in celibates. Well, one day, after Philip had 3 sons, his wife died. And Philip felt eligible to join, so he applied for membership into the Templars. The Templars blackballed him. All right. So he said to 5 knights, I believe they'll take you 5 in. I want you to infiltrate them and then report to me what they say. Because the Templars, they claimed to have a secret. And they were a secret organization, secret society, keeping their stuff secret. So these 5 knights infiltrated the Templars and came back and reported to the king that these Templars were engaging in sodomy, engaging in sex with demons, among other things. I mean, this is what they reported. I mean, you can decide for yourself how much truth it is. And that they were also worshiping Lucifer. So the king wrote a letter to the Pope, and the Pope and the king got together and decided these Templars must be dissolved. So, and for one reason, Friday the 13th is looked on as being unlucky. The Templars had 2 bad Friday the 13th. First of all, Jesus was crucified on Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th. Well, Saladin, when Saladin left all the army of the Christians go home, he said, but wait a minute, before you leave, I want all the Templars to go over here. So all the Templars go in place, and Saladin mowed them down. This was on a Friday the 13th. But Philip the Fair started slaughtering all the Templars, again on a Friday the 13th. Some of the Templars are said to have escaped and come to America before Columbus, and they buried a treasure somewhere up in Nova Scotia, and there have been many people looking for it. It has not been found. But the evidence that Templars are here, we have found Templar swords and Templar emblems in North America, indicating that some of them indeed did come to North America to escape. All right. But with a Templar vizier, as he was standing before Philip, he said, what you're doing is unjust. I said, I want you to meet me around the throne of God. Within a year, both the king and the pope were dead. Okay, what does this have to do with the 100 Years' War? Quite a bit. The king had 3 sons. They were all young. The first one got the throne. He died after 5 or 6 years. Basically, make a long story short, all 3 sons ruled for a total of 18 years, and the last one died without sons, so the line of the house of Capet came to an end. No more Capetians. Well, the French chose the house of Valois to be the next king. Don't worry about the name Valois. But the English king said, now wait a minute, I'm descended from French royalty also, I should be king. So this was the main, to make a long story short, this is the main reason for the fight. The King of England claimed that he had a right to the throne of the King of France, but the French people chose to pick the chose to pick their own men. And they raised up another King of France from a different dynasty. Now, as for the Templars, they went to Scotland, and it's believed that they helped the Scottish get their independence. But they had the goal, like the Teutonic Knights, of setting up an ideal state where there'd be no royalty and no nobility. And folks, some people believe that the ideal state they wound up setting up was the United States of America. The Templars became known as Masons, and the rest, they say, is history. Every one of our founding fathers were Masons. All right, there's a lot more I could say on that topic, but I feel uncomfortable talking about it, so I'll leave it. It's something you can research for yourself. But anyway, have any of you heard anything about this? I'm not asking if you agree, but at least one of you is nodding your head, you've at least heard about it. These stories get around. Again, if you research a temple, they claim that they discovered a secret in Solomon's temple, the secret of money making, and that they sure knew how to make the money. And they claimed to discover the secret of how you could build a really great society. And if the United States was that society, well, they might have. But again, standard historians say, oh, they had no secret. All right, anyway, the King of France, and France and England went to war. The war was to last 100 years. Well, the English, even though they're outnumbered 4-1, the English wound up winning. Wound up winning at first. Now, eventually, they wound up losing. The 100 Years' War was a turning point in the history of warfare. Number one, the English began using the longbow and the crossbow, and it was found that serfs who had longbows could kill knights with armor, with lances. And the longbow was about 6 feet long, and it could shoot arrows farther than the ordinary bow. Again, when I was a kid, I used to play with, we'd make bows and arrows from sticks laying around the house and from tree limbs. But they began to make long, and then the crossbow. The crossbow was an extremely strong bow that had to be cocked by a lever. And it could shoot an arrow really, really hard and penetrate every armor that existed. I mean, if it hit a knight in armor, it would penetrate the knight's armor. I mean, crossbows, and also the crossbow was very accurate. It was fired from a person's shoulder like a gun. Then gunpowder was used. Essentially, knights became somewhat outmoded as a result of the 100 Years' War. The common pikeman, the common foot soldier, became more and more important. I mean, these were changes in warfare that were made as a result of the 100 Years' War. Two important battles. Well, the main one I've asked you to remember is the Battle of Crusades. Essentially, what I want you to know about the Battle of Crusades, I'm going to have to close. The French greatly outnumbered the English, so the French knights galloped into the battle on their horseback with their heavy armor in the rain. The horses slipped in the mud, and a lot of the horses broke their legs. Of course, they never know have horses. When a horse breaks its leg, there's nothing to do but kill it. But the knights themselves, once they had fallen, most of the time they died in the fall. But it took 5 men to be able to pick them up. And most knights in their armor suffocated. Again, as the knights galloped into battle, they were met by arrows from the English longbowmen. And the arrows would penetrate the knight's shield and the armor both, just go right through the shield and armor, because the arrows were much better than they had been before. So between slipping in the mud and having their armor and shields penetrated by the arrows were shot by ordinary common men. I mean, not by nobility, but by commoners. The pikeman, the foot soldier, was able to gain a victory over the French. However, the battle was not decisive. The French could come back. I mean, the French outnumbered 4-1. The French could come back. All right, now, Again, the war was fought off and on for about 100 years, and sometimes the war shifted one way and then shifted another. But it was to lead to a woman coming on the scene, who we'll talk about next time, named Joan of Arc. All right, with this, I'm going to close.